The red light on Merchant Street lasts a long time. Long enough that I noticed the number I was already counting. The way you sometimes realize mid-sentence that you've been talking for a while without knowing what you started to say. 416. I didn't know I was counting. My hands were on the wheel, and the light was red, and I was counting the way you count when you're not doing it on purpose. The way the mind does arithmetic without asking permission. And the number was 416. 4 years of weekends. Saturday and Sunday, every week, consistent as weather. 416 mornings, he put on the blue fleece and filled the travel mug. The one with the lid that never quite sealed, that he'd press down and twist and press again in that specific way, the same sequence every time, and kissed my forehead and left. 416 mornings I went back to sleep, or made coffee, or did whatever Saturday people do on Saturday mornings when the house is still and comfortable and theirs. 416 mornings, he was somewhere that was not the hospice. I need to tell you that before anything else, because otherwise, the rest of this doesn't make sense. And I need to tell you something else first, something I need you to hold on to while I tell you the rest. He was a good man. I know how that sounds. I know what you're already thinking, what anyone would think, but I need you to understand it the way I mean it, which is not the way people mean it when they're defending someone indefensible. He was a good man. He was kind. He was present. He was interested in me in the specific way that matters, not generically attentive, not performing attention, but actually curious about who I was and how I thought and what I noticed. 14 years of that. 14 years of evidence assembled carefully. The way I assemble evidence when I'm trying to understand how a landscape functions over time, which is what I do for a living. I'm a landscape architect. I think in long timescales. I'm good at reading what things become over years. I was good at reading him. And I was reading something real. I want to be very clear about that. I was not fooled about the quality of what we had. I was incomplete. Those are different things. I'm still working out whether they're different enough. So, he was a good man, and he was somewhere I didn't know about for 416 mornings. And I'm going to tell you how I found out, which is going to take a while, because the finding out was slow, and it was the kind of slow that I can still feel in my body when I think about it. The particular physical sensation of understanding arriving in pieces when you would give anything for it to either stop arriving or arrive all at once. He died 14 months ago. Car accident. Wednesday morning, on a road he had no particular reason to be on, which I noted at the time and then didn't note, the way you note things and then put them down when you can't hold everything. 14 months. The grief is not what I need to tell you about. The grief is just the container for the rest of it. Let me back up. Let me tell you about an ordinary Saturday. This was 3 years ago, so a year before he died, which means 208 weekends before the last one. Nothing special about this particular Saturday. That's the point. It's the specific ordinary ones I keep going back to. It was early, 6:30 maybe. The light in our bedroom in July at 6:30 comes through the gap in the curtains at an angle that hits the mirror on the back of the door and throws a shape on the ceiling. Not quite a rectangle, something the room has made its own version of, and I've watched it move across the ceiling on enough early mornings that I know its pace, the way I know his breathing. He was in the bathroom. I could hear the water. I was in that state that is not quite asleep and not quite awake, which is the state I'm in most often when he leaves on Saturday mornings, which was by design. He was quiet so I could stay in it. He came to the side of the bed. He was already dressed. The blue fleece, jeans, the same boots he wore every weekend because he said they were comfortable, and I said they were falling apart and neither of us was wrong. He had the travel mug in his hand and he was pressing the lid, that particular sequence of press and twist and press, and the lid was doing what it always did, which was not quite sealing. He saw I was awake, not all the way. He leaned down and kissed my forehead, not my cheek, my forehead, because I was still mostly horizontal and he didn't want to fully rouse me. His hand on my shoulder, just there, just the weight of it, for a moment. The fleece smelled like cedar and something underneath that was just him, which is not a scent I can describe any more specifically than that. I've tried. I fell back asleep listening to the car leave the driveway. That specific sound, his car had a small hesitation before it caught, an engine thing I kept meaning to mention to the mechanic and never did because it always resolved itself in a second, and by the time we were anywhere, I'd forgotten about it. The hesitation, then the engine evening out, then the sound of him going. I went back to sleep. I've thought about that morning so many times in the past 14 months that I've worn it thin in places. Not because it was meaningful at the time. It wasn't. It was Tuesday. It was every Saturday. I think about it because it's specific, and specific is what I have left of him, and because specificity becomes precious in the same proportion as loss, which is something nobody tells you before grief, and everyone who has done it knows. And now I think about it for other reasons too. Now I think about the forehead instead of the cheek, and what I know now that I didn't know then, and the thinking changes the memory the way you can't change it back. I'll come back to that. 6 weeks after the funeral, I called the hospice. He had been a volunteer there for 4 years. Saturdays and Sundays, every week, 8 in the morning until usually 2 or 3 in the afternoon, sometimes later if there was a reason to stay. He said the residents needed consistency, that volunteers who showed up irregularly were harder on people than no volunteers at all, which I had never had any reason to doubt because it sounded like him, and it sounded true, and I had seen him leave for it 416 mornings. He talked about it the way people talk about something they feel called to, not dramatically, not performing virtue, just matter of fact. He said it was important. He had a colleague who had died in a hospice years ago and had said the volunteers made a difference, and he had believed her. He was the kind of person who remembered things like that and acted on them years later. The hospice had a number of his jackets and some books he'd said they could use. I was 6 weeks past the funeral and not making major decisions. I was not selling the house, not cleaning out his office yet, not doing anything that felt like it was moving something from one state to another permanently, but donating things felt manageable. I called to arrange it. The woman on the phone was kind. She took my name. She said she'd check for the coordinator for his particular program to make sure the things would be useful. She put me on hold. She came back and said she was having a little trouble locating his name in the volunteer database, and could I give her the spelling again? I gave her the spelling. She said, "I'm sorry, I'm not finding it. Can I take your number and have someone call you back?" Someone called me back that afternoon. She was apologetic, professional. She said their records were digital going back 8 years, and before that, they had paper records that were scanned. She had searched both. There was no volunteer by his name, not currently, not historically, not in any format she could find. I said, "Are you sure? He volunteered there every weekend for 4 years." She said she was sure, but that these things sometimes got filed incorrectly, and she would escalate it to their volunteer coordinator. She was very kind. She gave me her direct number. I filed it as an administrative error. Volunteer programs are chaotic. I've done landscaping work for nonprofits. I know how their paperwork goes. Things get lost. Names get misspelled. Records are incomplete. I believed this explanation for 2 weeks without any particular effort because it was the kind of explanation that's exactly plausible enough. 2 weeks later, I called back. Different person, same answer. The volunteer coordinator herself this time, who had been running the program for 6 years. She said there was no record, and she was confident she would know if there were a long-term volunteer whose records had simply been lost, because she made it her business to know the volunteers. I thanked her and said there must be some confusion, and I hung up. I drove to the hospice the following Wednesday. I thought about waiting until the weekend, but I didn't want to wait until the weekend. I brought 2 photographs. One from our wedding, which I'd chosen because it was a clear, full-face photograph from a time when he was younger and might not have looked exactly as he did at the end, and one from 3 years ago, a birthday photograph at a dinner we'd had with friends, the last one where he looked fully himself and not yet sick. The hospice is a 15-minute drive from our house. It's a converted building in what used to be a residential neighborhood. It looks like a large home that was expanded slowly over time, which is more or less what it is. I've driven past it hundreds of times. I'd never been inside. That should have been strange to me before that day. It wasn't. I showed the photographs to 3 different people. A young man at the reception desk who had been there 2 years. A program coordinator who had been there 4. A nurse, 8 years at that hospice, she told me, because I asked specifically for someone who had been there a long time. The nurse held the birthday photograph for a while. She turned it slightly to get better light on it. She said, "He looks kind." And then she said, "I'm sorry, I really don't know this face." She handed the photograph back. I said thank you. I put both photographs back in my bag. I thanked all 3 of them and I went to the parking lot. My car was under a tree that had gone yellow at the edges. The kind of yellowing that happens in the second half of September when summer is still technically present, but you can smell it leaving. I sat in the driver's seat. The photographs were in my bag. My hands were in my lap. I was looking at the dashboard. I don't know exactly what I was looking at or how long I sat there. 4 years. Every Saturday and Sunday. I never went. He had said it was hard for the residents when family members came along with volunteers. It could confuse them, remind them of their own family members in painful ways, disrupt the particular equilibrium that long-term care settings require. He said the volunteers were most effective when they came alone and came consistently. He said this once, maybe twice, and I accepted it completely because it sounded like something that could be true, and because I was not a person who needed to monitor where my husband went on Saturday mornings. I trusted him. I did not frame it as trusting him. It was smaller than that, more basic. I simply never thought about it. The way you don't think about the ground under your feet until there's a reason to. I started the car. I drove home. I thought about what I had been told in a very specific, procedural way. No record in the database, the coordinator who would have known him, the nurse who said she really didn't know this face. And I sorted it into a category labeled something else. And I did not look at what was in that category yet. He had volunteered somewhere. Not there. Somewhere else. People volunteer places and get the details wrong over time. The hospice down the street, the hospice in the next neighborhood, a care facility that wasn't technically a hospice. He had said hospice because that was what he thought it was. He had gone somewhere else. There was an explanation. There was always an explanation. I told myself this until I mostly believed it, and then I went to bed. The shopping list is still on the fridge. I want to tell you that because it matters later, or it matters throughout, which is maybe the same thing. It's a page from a notepad in his handwriting. Bread, milk, the specific brand of orange juice he liked and I didn't, stamps, dry cleaning. The list is from 3 weeks before he died. I picked up the dry cleaning the week after the funeral, because there it was, on the list. And then I stood in the dry cleaning place holding 2 of his shirts in plastic wrap and realized there was no longer anyone to pick them up for, and I brought them home anyway, and they're in the closet. The magnet holding the list is from a market in Portugal, 8 years ago. We had taken a long weekend, just the 2 of us, one of those trips you take when you suddenly have the time and the money both at once, and you decide to go instead of waiting for the right moment, because you've been waiting for the right moment, and you've gotten old enough to know the right moment is the one where you actually go. We ate grilled fish at a table overlooking something blue. He bought the magnet because I said it was too expensive for a magnet, which made him want it more. I've been looking at that magnet for 14 months. I should take the list down. I know I should take it down. I've been not taking it down as a decision, not out of passivity. Some things I'm not doing yet, and that's one of them. I'll get there. I found the storage unit key in October, 4 months after the funeral. His desk is in the study, which is the room at the back of the house that was going to be something else. A guest room, a workspace for me, and then became his slowly over years, the way a space becomes someone's without a moment you can point to. The desk is an old oak thing we bought at an estate sale early in our marriage. Too heavy to move easily, which is probably why it stayed when other furniture went. The surface has a circular stain from a coffee mug that he put there once in the early years, and I was irritated about, and then got used to, and now is just the desk. I was clearing the desk. Not everything. I wasn't ready for everything. The surface first. Then the top drawer. Then I thought that was enough for one day, and then I thought, One more drawer. The bottom right drawer had a hanging file with old tax documents that I needed for the estate anyway, so I pulled it out. Behind it, pushed to the back of the drawer, was a small wooden box. I've seen that box for years. It lived on the surface of the desk for a long time, then migrated to the drawer. I assumed it held cufflinks or similar small things. He wore cufflinks sometimes, for certain occasions, the silver ones his father had given him. I'd never opened it. I opened it. Inside was a key and a folded piece of paper. The paper was a rental agreement, a storage unit in an industrial park near the highway, rented in his name, billing address our house. The monthly payment amount was at the bottom of the first page. Reasonable, unremarkable. The kind of number that would appear on a bank statement and mean nothing in isolation. Except I had gone through our bank statements for the estate, and I had not seen this number, which meant it was coming from somewhere else. I sat at the desk with the key in one hand and the rental agreement in the other for a while. Then I took the rental agreement to the kitchen table, the one with the slightly uneven leg, the one we've shimmed twice without fully fixing, and I read it again. The start date of the rental was 6 years ago. 6 years ago, we were still new to this house. 6 years ago, we had been married 8 years, and his mother was still alive, and we were talking about whether we wanted to renovate the kitchen. 6 years ago, I was designing a public park in the eastern part of the city, and I remember that year clearly because it was the year that project almost fell apart, and then didn't, and it's still there. You can go see it. The lavender beds came from that project. He said he liked the smell of lavender, which is how that became the thing I planted. A storage unit, 6 years ago. I looked up the account number from the rental agreement at the bank. I called, explained I was handling the estate. The account had existed for 6 years. The balance was modest. Regular monthly withdrawals that matched the storage unit payment. Occasional other withdrawals. Not frequent, not large. The account was in his name alone. Here is where I could tell you I felt the ground open. But that's not how it was. The ground didn't open. It just started to feel slightly less solid than usual. The way you feel when you're walking on ground that's been waterlogged. That gives a little differently under each step in a way that is subtle and consistent, and not yet catastrophic. That's how it was. I drove to the storage unit the next morning. The industrial park near the highway is the kind of place that functions without anyone having to think about it. Warehouses, small manufacturing, a cluster of self-storage units near the entrance with a keypad gate that opened when I entered the code from the rental agreement. My car was the only car. The units were low concrete buildings in 2 rows facing each other, and his was in the second row, near the end. Unit 41, which I found by counting, which is the thing I do now, counting, without deciding to. The key turned cleanly. The lock was well maintained, not sticky, the mechanism moving easily the way a mechanism moves when it's used regularly. I noted this. I filed it. I lifted the shutter door. A car. I didn't recognize it. A dark blue sedan, older, clean. A temporary license plate in the rear window that had expired 9 months ago, which meant it had been there at least 9 months. 12 boxes, lined up along the right wall, each one labeled in his handwriting with a number, not a word. 1 through 12. A folding chair, the canvas kind, collapsed against the left wall. A small lamp on a milk crate, plugged into an extension cord that ran to an outlet near the door. The lamp was on. The timer function, I understood later. He had it on a timer. It came on in the morning and went off at night, which was presumably so the outlet didn't cause a problem, and possibly for other reasons. But standing there in the entrance to the storage unit, the small lamp on the milk crate was just on, as if someone were there, or expected, and on the floor. To the left of the car, leaning against the wall, a framed photograph. A woman, somewhere in her early 40s, dark-haired, standing in a garden with 2 children, a boy and a girl, both somewhere between 8 and 12, the specific gap between childhood and adolescence, where faces are becoming what they're going to be. The woman was laughing at something happening outside the frame. One of the children was looking at the camera. And standing beside the woman, slightly apart but present in the way people are present in family photographs, relaxed, comfortable, belonging there, was my husband. His arm was not around her. They were not touching. But the space between them was the space between people who know each other well enough to not need to touch to communicate proximity. I looked at the photograph from the doorway. I did not go inside. The lamp was on, and the boxes were numbered, and the car had an expired temporary plate, and my husband was in a photograph with a woman and 2 children I did not recognize. I pulled the shutter door down. I heard it lock when the key turned back. I drove home. The drive was 20 minutes. I don't remember it. I sat in the driveway. The motion sensor light over the garage door came on when I pulled in, and went off 2 minutes later and came on again when I shifted in my seat and went off again. It did this 3 times. I counted. I know it was 40 minutes because of the light and the 2-minute intervals and the 3 cycles. 40 minutes in my own driveway, looking at my own garage door, counting a light. I've been counting a lot of things. Here is what I did not do. I did not call anyone. I did not call my sister, who is the person I call when I can't hold something alone, and who called me every day for the first 3 months after the funeral, and still calls 3 times a week, and who I have not told, to this day, most of what I'm telling you. I did not call my friend Mara, who is the practical one, the one who would have helped me make a list. I did not call the estate attorney, whose name is Warren, and who has been handling the estate with quiet competence, and who was going to need to know about the storage unit at some point. I went inside. I stood in the kitchen. The shopping list on the fridge, the Portugal magnet, his handwriting. I went to the closet in the bedroom. At the back, where I'd put it after the funeral, was the blue fleece. I took it out. I held it. It still smells like him, though less now than it did. 14 months, that's what 14 months does. The smell becoming something I remember more than actually smell. I held it for a moment. I put it back. I closed the closet. Then I went and I did the thing that in retrospect I should have done the second I put the key in the lock, and felt the mechanism move that easily. I went to bed. I lay there. I did not sleep. In the morning, I called a private investigator. I want to explain why I did that instead of something else, because it seems like there should have been a step between standing in my driveway counting a motion sensor light and calling a private investigator. There wasn't. The step would have been telling someone what I'd found, and to tell someone what I'd found, I would have had to say it out loud. And to say it out loud, I would have had to decide what it was. And I didn't know what it was. I knew what it looked like. I didn't know what it was. I needed information before I could say anything to anyone. Because if I said something to someone, and then it turned out to be something else, some explanation I wasn't seeing, something that made it make sense, I would have said words about my husband that couldn't be unsaid. So I called someone whose job it was to find information, and I paid him in cash, and I gave him the registration number from the car in the storage unit, and the photograph of the woman and the children, taken with my phone through the gap in the shutter door, at an angle that was awkward, but clear enough. I told him I needed to know who the woman was. I told him I would not explain why. He said that was fine. He charged me $800. He was professional and efficient. 3 weeks later, he sent me a file. I was at the kitchen table when I opened it. The table with the uneven leg. The table where we ate dinner for 11 years. It's a Tuesday afternoon in November, 3 months ago. And the light through the kitchen window is the flat winter kind. No shadows. Everything equally visible. The woman's name was in the file. Her address. 40 minutes from my house. In a direction I rarely went. But 40 minutes. That same number. She had 2 children. The boy and the girl. She had been widowed 14 months ago. Her husband had died in a car accident. The date in the file was his death date. The time was the time of his accident. The road was the road he died on, which I had noted at the time, and then put down. A road that was 40 minutes from our house, which I had understood as an aberration, a wrong turn, someone else's road, and which was in fact a road he knew. Her husband's name was different from my husband's name. His face in the photographs the investigator had included was my husband's face. I read the file 3 times. Then I closed it. The laptop screen went dark, and I was looking at the reflection of the kitchen window in the laptop screen, the flat winter light, my own hands on the table edge. I made tea. I don't know why I made tea specifically. I stood at the counter and drank it. I opened the file again when I came back to the table. I read it again. I closed it again. I went to bed. I didn't sleep. At 4 in the morning I went to the garden. The garden is mine, mostly. He liked it. He liked being in it. But the decisions were always mine. I've been a landscape architect for 17 years, and the garden is the place where I think most clearly, which means it's also the place I've come to more than once in the past 14 months when the house got too heavy in a particular way. In winter, at 4 in the morning, the garden is just a shape in the dark. The beds, the paths, the structure I've built over years that I know without seeing it. The lavender bed is on the west side, sheltered from the main wind by the fence. I planted the lavender because he said he liked the smell of it. 7 years ago. I planted it on a Saturday morning when he was gone, which is often when I did the garden work, the big projects. He would leave and I would put on old clothes and spend 4 hours doing something that needed doing. I planted the lavender because he liked it and I thought it would please him to come home to. And he did come home, and he said it was beautiful, and I thought about that planting every spring when it came back. He liked the smell of lavender. That's a real thing. That's not a lie. A person who is living 2 lives still likes the smell of lavender. The facts that are true are still true. I stood near the lavender bed in the dark, because some thoughts you cannot have inside, and I had a thought I'd been not having for 3 months. The 416 mornings. I'd been holding them as a fact, a number, a logistics problem, almost. How does a person manage 2 separate lives for 4 years? What does the infrastructure of that look like? How do the weekends work? How do the holidays work? How does it not collapse under its own weight? I'd been thinking about it the way I'd think about a structural problem at work, which is to say, I'd been using the professional part of my brain as a shelter from the other part. The other part. He kissed my forehead on 416 mornings and drove 40 minutes to someone else. He put his hand on my shoulder and he left, and he drove to a house I've never been to, where there are 2 children whose names I know now from the investigator's file, and he was someone whose name I didn't know, and he came home on Sunday evenings and we made dinner together, and he asked me about my week. He was good to me. That's the thing I can't put down. He was genuinely, consistently good to me, present, interested. The evidence I have for this is 14 years of specific moments, and not one of those moments feels false to me, even now, even holding the investigator's file, even knowing what I know. I keep examining the evidence to find where the error was, the way you examine a design that has failed, looking for the flaw in the foundation, the miscalculation in the load-bearing structure. I cannot find it. The evidence was real. The conclusion was incomplete. He loved me, I believe. In whatever way he was capable of it, I believe he did. And he drove 40 minutes in a different direction for 4 years. And I do not know how both of these things are true. And I have been trying to find the mechanism that reconciles them, and I cannot find it. And I have decided, standing in the garden at 4:15 in the morning in November, that the mechanism may not exist. That some things do not reconcile, that you can live inside an irreconcilable thing if you are honest with yourself that it is irreconcilable. And that is not the same as lying to yourself. I thought about the forehead instead of the cheek. He kissed my forehead because I was still mostly asleep and he didn't want to wake me fully. That was a kindness, specifically and genuinely a kindness. He was leaving to go somewhere I didn't know about, and he was kind about waking me, and those 2 things existed at the same time on every one of 416 Saturday mornings. A person who is capable of both. I have to be able to say that and hold it without resolving it, because it is not resolvable, and it is the truest thing I know about him now, which is that he contained both. And I loved the part I knew completely, and the part I didn't know was also him, and I do not know what to do with that. What was taken from me is not the marriage. The marriage was real. What was taken from me is completeness. I had a complete version of something that was not complete, and I built myself in relation to it. My understanding of being loved, my understanding of what trust looks like, my understanding of who I was in relation to who he was. And the structure is real, but the foundation I built it on is not the foundation I thought it was. And that is a different kind of loss from losing him. And it lives alongside the grief for him in a way I cannot separate them. And some mornings, I don't know which one I'm feeling. That is the specific grief inside the grief. I'm going to ask you to hold that for a moment before I tell you what I did next. I stood in the garden until the sky separated. That particular moment, in winter, when dark becomes almost dark, becomes a color that is not quite any color, and the shapes of things gain edges again. The lavender bed, the path, the fence, things becoming visible. I went inside. I put the kettle on. I looked at the shopping list. Then I went to the storage unit. I went back alone. I know I said that before. Both times I went alone. I want to be clear that this was a decision, not a default. I knew people I could have brought. I chose not to because the storage unit was mine to see on my own terms, before it was anyone else's to see. And because some things you need to move through by yourself before you can explain them to anyone. And because if I had brought someone with me, they would have been there inside my experience of it. And I needed to be there inside my own experience of it, without managing anyone else's response. I opened the unit. The lamp was on. I went inside. The car was registered to a name I now knew from the file, the name he had used in that other life. I looked at the name on the registration for a moment. It was his face in the photograph in the file, and a name that was not what I called him, and I said the name out loud, quietly, to myself, in the storage unit. And it sounded like a stranger's name, and that is the only time I have said it, and I don't think I will say it again. The boxes were along the right wall, 1 through 12. His handwriting on each one, dark marker on cardboard, the handwriting I know the way I know his voice. I stood in front of them for a while. Then I opened box 7. I don't know why 7, I just did. Inside, documents. A lease agreement for an address I didn't know, the address in the investigator's file. Bank records for the second account. A folder of photographs, which I looked at and then closed. And at the bottom of the box, underneath the documents, a card. A birthday card. The kind that is a small square in a matching envelope. The envelope already opened. On the outside of the envelope, in his handwriting, just an address, no name. Inside the card, "You make every year better. I love you." His handwriting, his signature. No name on the card, no recipient. I don't know which of us he was writing to. I stood there with that for a while. The honest truth is that I think he meant it both times. Whichever birthday it was for, whichever woman he was sitting across from when he wrote it, he meant it. That is the irreconcilable thing. He was not a person who said things he didn't mean. He was a person who found himself in a situation where the truth had 2 different addresses, and he maintained both of them. And I do not understand how. And I have stopped trying to understand how because I have come to the conclusion that there are architectures the human mind builds that other humans cannot read from the outside. And I lived with this man and I cannot read it, and I have to be done trying. I put the card back. I closed box 7. I looked at the photograph on the floor, still leaning against the wall where it had been the first time I came. I hadn't touched it. It was exactly as I'd left it. The woman, the children, him. The garden behind them that I didn't recognize. She is a widow too. She has 2 children. She has been holding this for 14 months in a version that is different from mine. She had a life with a man whose name turned out to be a different name, who had a house in a neighborhood she may not have known existed. She has her own 416 mornings, in whatever form they took for her. She has her own irreconcilable thing. I closed the unit. I drove home. I called Warren, the estate attorney, and told him I had found a storage unit in the estate that I hadn't been aware of, and that it would need to be addressed before we could close. He said that was fine. These things come up. We'd talk through the specifics when I was ready. I was not ready yet. I had one other call to make first. It took me 3 attempts. The first time, I dialed her number. I had it from the investigator's file, and I let it ring once and ended the call. I did this sitting at the kitchen table at 9 in the morning, and I put the phone face down on the table and went and stood in the garden for 20 minutes, and then I came back and did it again. Second ring, this time. Then ended the call. The third time, I let it go. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was the kind of voice that sounds careful. Someone who has learned to be careful on the phone with unknown numbers. She said hello. I said, "I think your husband and my husband were the same person." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think so too." She said it so quickly that I understood she had been expecting a call like this for a while. Not from me specifically, from someone. She had been knowing something she couldn't verify, the way I had, and she had been waiting for the knowing to arrive with a name. We talked for 40 minutes. I'm not going to tell you everything about that conversation. Some things are mine, some things are hers. The middle of that conversation belongs to both of us, and it was not for anyone else. And she and I agreed, by the end, that it would stay that way. What I'll tell you is the texture of it. That we were both crying by the middle, not for the same reasons, and then by the end we were not crying, and there was something in that, the passing through to the other side of it, together, with a stranger who was not entirely a stranger. She has a particular kind of dry precision to the way she talks about hard things. I think she's funny in the way people are funny when they've been through something that could either destroy them or teach them to make small, precise jokes about it, and she chose the second one. I think in another life we might have been friends. That is a strange thing to think. I think it anyway. By the end, we had made two decisions. Neither of us would pursue the estate legally. This is a judgment call I have made, and I am at peace with it. She has her life and her children, and I have mine, and the man we shared is dead. And what any court could do with that information felt like more destruction than either of us needed. I talked to Warren. I told him I had concluded there were no additional legal beneficiaries to the estate. This is technically correct. What I did not tell him is everything that led me to that conclusion. The second decision, we would not contact each other again unless one of us changed her mind about the first decision. She and I said goodbye. I put the phone down. I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about the fact that I had just had the most honest conversation I've had in 14 months, with a woman my husband created a second life with, and there was something almost funny about that. And then I thought about the children, and it was not funny. And then I just sat there. A few weeks later, I went through the estate with Warren. The storage unit was cleared. The car was sold. The boxes were gone through and mostly donated. The documents I handled with Warren. The photographs I didn't explain in detail. The numbered boxes containing the life he had built in a direction I didn't know about. The bank account was closed. The photograph. The woman and the children and him in a garden somewhere. I did not throw away and I did not keep. On the last day I had the storage unit, I leaned it back against the wall where I'd found it, and I closed the unit and turned in the key. I don't know why I did it that way. It felt like the right thing. She has a copy of that photograph somewhere in her house, presumably, in whatever form she keeps his photographs, in whatever she has decided to do with them. I didn't need my own copy. And I couldn't throw it away because it is her children in that photograph, and they have a right to exist. They have a right to their photographs of their father, and throwing the photograph away felt like arguing with that. So I left it, the photograph in the empty unit. I closed the door. I've been living with partial understanding since then. I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because I think people hear partial understanding and they think, she's still working on figuring it out. I'm not. I have the facts. I know what happened. What I don't have is the interior of it. Why, in the specific way that means, what was he telling himself? How did he live with it? What did he think he was doing? What did he think he was giving us, both of us, that justified the architecture he built? I will never know that. He's dead. Even if he weren't dead, I might not know, because people don't always know how to explain the irreconcilable things they've built, or they know and can't say it, or they've made peace with not saying it and will never say it. I've decided to stop standing in the doorway of that question. I've been in it for months and I can see there's no floor. I'm a landscape architect. I know which grounds are stable enough to build on. That ground is not. What I'm building on instead is this: 14 years of evidence that was real. A marriage that was real. A life inside that marriage that was mine and was real. These things are true. They don't stop being true because they were incomplete. I know this intellectually, and I'm working on knowing it in the other way, the felt way, the way that changes how you move through a morning. It's going slower than the intellectual version. That's fine. I have time. This past Saturday, I drove for 43 minutes without knowing where I was going, which is something I've been doing on bad Saturdays for months, just driving until the shape of the absence has somewhere to be besides the house. I counted the 416 at a red light on Merchant Street, which is the first time I've counted them in weeks, and I sat in the counting for a moment, and then the light changed. I came home. I made coffee. I stood at the counter with the coffee, and I looked at the shopping list on the fridge. The Portugal magnet. Bread, milk, the orange juice I didn't like. The dry cleaning I picked up and had nowhere to bring. Then I went to the bedroom. I opened the closet. The blue fleece was in the back, where I'd put it after the funeral. I reached past the other things and I took it out. I held it in both hands, in the way you hold something you're not sure what to do with yet. The worn places at the elbows. The specific shade of blue that is not quite navy and not quite cornflower. The smell is mostly gone now. Mostly just the smell of fabric and the closet. But underneath it, faint. Something. Maybe just what I remember. Maybe enough. I put it on. It's too big. It was always too big for me, which I knew without ever having tried it on before. I stood in the bedroom in his blue fleece that was too big for me, and the morning light was coming through the curtain gap at its angle, and I looked at the shape it threw on the ceiling. I left it on. I went to the garden. The lavender is cut back for winter, just the low woody structure of it, waiting. In spring, it will come back. It always does, which is one of the things I love about lavender, and one of the things I planted it knowing. You cut it back and it returns, different each time and recognizably itself. I stood in the garden for a while. Then I came inside. The fleece is on the hook by the back door, which is where he used to hang it when he came home. I don't know yet if it will stay there. I'm not making that decision today. I'm not making major decisions. What I know is that I loved him. What I know is that it was real. What I know is that I am standing in a life that is mine, that has his books on the shelves in the system only I understand now, and his shopping list on the fridge, and his fleece on the hook by the door, and a lavender bed in the garden that came back every spring for 7 years and will come back again. Why he did it? That's the question without a floor. I've walked to the edge of it many times in the past 14 months and looked down, and it goes further than I can see, and I've turned back every time. I'll probably walk to the edge again. That's honest. Some questions have a pool that doesn't stop just because you've decided they have no bottom. But I'm not standing in the doorway anymore. I made coffee. I looked at the shopping list. I put on his fleece. It's a Saturday morning. There are things I know how to do.